Can you move it forward? The other mouse, okay. Okay, we know since the first paper of Kelly and Wendell that macular hole is a curable disease. In the 90s, we had some adjuvants era, which is already over. And currently, we have ILM peeling era in the treatment of macular hole. Before we do ILM peeling, we have to remove posterior hyaloid, which sometimes is easy, but sometimes posterior hyaloid is relatively difficult to remove. In most cases, you have to do it. Here you see a very special case of traumatic macular hole operated many years ago when I did not perform inverted ILM flap technique. And in this specific case, I couldn't remove posterior hyaloid, otherwise that I began to peel ILM. And when I tried different instruments, it was maybe 2004 or so, and finally I peeled a piece of ILM around the macular hole, and this helped me to peel or to remove the posterior hyaloid. You see it here better on this part of video. This is posterior hyaloid detachment. Then we peel ILM all around the macular hole. It is also older video, and everybody of you knows the technology. We peel ILM routinely around the macular hole in each case. I did it until 2005. What do we achieve? We induce some gliosis by trauma to the retina tissue and give some surface with gas injection for macular hole to close. But here you see a specific case which I had in 2005. I couldn't understand the pathology with OCT stratus because at that time we had only OCT stratus, but it was splitting of inner and outer retina layers. At that time I peeled ILM all around as usual, and I also tried to peel the ILM from the torn inner layers of the retina, and in a moment you will see that I peeled not only the ILM, but this whitish tissue was also removed. I don't know what kind of tissue was it, but finally the case ended up with flat open macular hole or type 2 macular hole, and actually I do not like this type of closure, so I began to think, what can I do? And actually I found that the only tissue I can use for improvement of my technology is the ILM. I was afraid of everything what we said today, that ILM is a scaffold for epiretinal membrane formation. So I peeled ILM up to margins of macular hole, did not remove it completely, trimmed it to reduce the risk of epiretinal membrane formation, and covered macular hole on the top of the retina surface. Finally, we did a few hundred cases before we decided to present it to the international community, and we published that in 2010, and the technique was performed since 2006. Here you see once again the classical approach when we stopped trimming the ILM because we found that there is no risk of epiretinal membrane formation in these cases. Here you see ILM is peeled all around the macular hole, but not removed completely. But in these cases, we covered macular hole with several layers of ILM, as you will see in a moment. But also, if you look on this area, during fluid air exchange, the nasal part of the ILM flaps moves into its original position during fluid air exchange. Actually, this led us to modification of the technique, and we found that temporal flap is enough to close the macular hole. The results were statistically significantly without differences between both techniques. But what we get with temporal flap, we get nerve fiber layers defects only on the site where ILM was peeled. Currently, we have several papers confirming this technique for large macular holes. And also we have papers confirming that for myopic macular holes. In our paper from macular holes, we found that photoreceptor defects and external limiting membrane defects decrease over time, which correlates with improvement in visual acuity. We have several papers confirming the efficacy of this technique for myopic macular holes, but I would like to cite two of them from the groups famous for submacular buckle. The upper one, led by Carlos Mateo, found that there is possibility to treat macular holes with axial length above 30 mm, which was not possible before what we know from the paper of Suda. The lower one, led by Grazia Pertile, found that outcomes reported with this technique were better than any other technique described until now. We have several papers showing comparative studies between classical approach and inverted ILM flap, and all of them show that both anatomical and classical anatomical and functional results are better with inverted ILM flap. The only paper who found no difference in functional results between myopic macular holes with retinal detachment was the paper of Baba and co-workers, but they compared only closed macular holes. So they had 36% of closure in classic approach and 80% with ILM flap, but they compared only these cases between them. In paper led by Grazia Pertile, they found also that likelihood of surgical effectiveness was increased by 22 times when inverted ILM flap was performed in myopic macular hole. Now I would like to cite some slides from Stanislao Rizzo, who presented, but until now not published, his paper. He found that in small macular holes, we have no big difference between classical and inverted flap, but this may mean that we also have no inferiority of inverted flap, but it was highly statistically significant in large macular holes. Also, he did not find any difference in eyes with axial length lower than 26 mm, but he found highly statistically significance in eyes with axial length above 26 mm, also by closure by atrophy. And here you see some examples. Here is traumatic macular hole with subretinal fibrosis treated with inverted ILM flap technique. You see surgical approach, preoperative swept source CT image and postoperative image. And as we currently do, I do not trim the flap. And here you see relatively large flap covering the macular hole by the end of surgery, which enabled to close this difficult case. Another example is myopic macular hole retinal detachment. And in these cases, I usually try to begin with removal some subretinal fluid through the hole, but without touching the hole, and then cover the macular hole with inverted flap. In early postoperative period, we may see some presence of fluid, even if the macular hole is closed, but this may disappear over time. Reoperations are rare. In our group of patients, we had 3.8% of reoperations, and we had 32 cases in 830 macular holes. And why do we reoperate? The cause of reoperation is that flap moved away from macular hole, and if you look on the reoperation, you simply put it once again on the top of macular hole, but it may move away Also during silicone oil injection. Here you see almost complete filling with silicone oil, but flap moved once again away from macula hole. And in these cases, it is relatively simple to cover it once again and secure flap in position. If you achieve that, you have 100% closure of macula hole. What happens with swept source OCT images in these cases? We found new type of flap closure, of macula hole closure, what we call flap closure. And in 1 week postoperative period, you see that macula hole is closed only with the flap, but we observe regeneration or reapproximation of the tissue over the next follow-up, and which correlates with improvement in visual acuity. This will be published quite soon. And what is the future? The future, I think, is to convince the retinological community to change the strategy for macula hole and development of new modification of the technique and new indication. Very interesting paper, which is future and current now, is paper of Chakrabarty and co-workers who used this technique combined with some blood in fovea, and they did not use any tamponade to close macula hole. Also interesting technique for those who still do not believe in inverted flap is autologous transplantation of internal limiting membrane presented by Morizana and co-workers, but this technique is useful for those cases where ILM was already peeled and we have no closure of macula hole. And finally, the idea of Tamer Mahmoud, autologous neurosensory retinal free flap, which was discussed yesterday. So in conclusion, I would like to state that inverted internal limiting membrane flap technique may be successfully used for macula hole closure and gives a new impulse for progress of new techniques in retinology. Thank you very much for your attention.